Welcome to our fourth lecture on urban governance and power sharing. So for this lecture, we're going to talk about models of governance as well as sort of defining what governance is. We're also going to talk about cities and power. And then finally, we're going to talk about models of power. So first, let's talk about what governance is. As your readings sort of define, governance is defined as processes through which public and private resources are coordinated to address collective issues. I want to make it clear here that governance is different than government, okay? So you can think about government as the elected officials and the bureaucracy and the rules and the structures that go into your local government. So if I were to walk into City Hall, we would see the elected officials there. We would see the bureaucrats that work there. Though that is government, okay? Governance, though, is the process of delivering services and policies to people, okay? And oftentimes governance, especially at the local level, is typically a combination of both public resources and private resources. We no longer live in an era where policies are implemented purely by the government, especially at the local level. Oftentimes, those services can be contracted out. So think, for instance, about the transit network that we have in town. That is contracted out in a way. Many local services are combinations of public and private partnerships. Okay, sometimes it's contracted out, sometimes it's local government and private actors working together on something. But in any case, we see, especially now, public and private industry working together to deliver policies and administer policies at the local level. Now, there are 4 models of governance that I want to go over real quick. There is managerial governance, so public services, just like I talked about, are contracted out, and citizens are seen more as customers. Okay, this is a really common way to think about governance now, especially in the American context. There is corporatist governance, which we're not going to touch on as much, but that just is like organized interests in local government. There is pro-growth government, where cities are more focused on local economic development at the expense of redistribution. This is also quite common in American cities. Think about how most American cities are focused on economic development, revitalization, bringing businesses in to the town or the city. Remember a few years back when there was a ton of competition for Amazon to make its next headquarters in like 100 cities that applied? That is pro-growth governance, right? They're trying to attract other businesses to stay there so that they can provide jobs for the local economy. That is pro-growth governance. And then finally, there's welfare governance. So this is oftentimes local socialism that comes from the state or some combination of the state and the local government. I should be clear here, though, that I know that some people would say like pro-growth government and managerial governance are quite common in the American context, but there are many failing American cities that would more fit into the welfare governance model. Okay, and many European cities as well. Particularly in the American context, these tend to be sort of industrial cities that have declined in terms of population and industry over the past 30, 40 years. Okay, so cities, though, do not operate independently, right? They do not operate independently. Oftentimes they are sharing power. They can be sharing power with other cities in the region. Think, for instance, about Seattle and Yakima. Those are likely cities that are sharing some kinds of powers together. They are also likely sharing power with other cities in the world. Okay, you can think about these as global cities. They are also likely sharing power and thereby competing in some ways with other sort of bureaucratic agencies. So when a local government works on housing policy, they're also probably working with HUD at the federal level to administer housing at the local level. Here's a big one. They are likely sharing power with their own nation. Okay, you can think about some pretty significant cities in the American context that are very, very, very powerful. Think New York City, think Los Angeles. Those are the kinds of cities that are challenging and also sort of economically advantageous for nations to have, right? Oftentimes, the federal government doesn't do a lot of oversight for cities. So in some ways, the economic ties that city has internationally work well for the nation. And in other times, it's difficult for the nation to have true control over that city. And then finally, there are supranational organizations. This, by supra, that means like sort of above nations. A good one here is the European Union, as an example, right? That oversees multiple nations and therefore multiple cities. So cities are oftentimes working with and therefore sharing power with supranational organizations. Power can also lead to conflict, though, right? There are many instances of, like, yes, they are sharing power, but sharing power often leads to conflict as well. So what are the causes of this sort of shared government and governance across or between these different kinds of actors, between cities and states, between cities and nations, between cities and other global cities? There are 4 reasons. The first one is globalization, right? We've touched on this previously in yesterday's lecture, but globalization is really driving a lot of this, right? As cities need to compete globally, they are becoming financial hubs. So New York City is a financial hub that the nation doesn't have, the federal government doesn't have great control over, for instance, okay? And many global cities like this are positioning themselves as the hub of commerce for their country. And so when you have something like that, that inherently puts your city in conflict in some cases with their national government. We also have metropolitanization. So that means that cities, as they grow, as they urbanize, they are not confined to the city limits. Okay, you can think about Boise, for instance. We wouldn't think of Boise as like ending right at the like Boise city limit. We would think of that as like continuing on to Nampa, for instance, right? There's a metropolitan area. And as cities expand and as those boundaries expand, they create conflicts both among those cities in the metro area, but they also create opportunities for higher levels of government to, like states or nations, to interfere in those conflicts, right, among those cities in that metro area. The next one is systems of cities. There are cities that are oftentimes complementary to each other. This one applies more in Asia than it does in the North American context. In Asia, specifically China, those cities are better planned than cities in the United States or Europe. So they tend to plan their cities to complement one another. So the federal government, their national government, is planning cities in order for them to complement one another, to work together. And then finally, internationalization, right? We are increasingly trying to attract international firms, international businesses, and international visitors to these cities, okay? But these are sort of those larger factors that are driving power sharing among cities and nations. So there are different kinds of institutional arrangements, though, for how much power a city is going to have. If you have a centralized unitary system, that means that the federal government controls most operations from very up high in the federal government, they're dictating what states can do, they're dictating what cities can do, if anything at all, and it's highly controlled. In this system, in a centralized unitary system, you're really not going to see too much power or discretion given to cities. The next one is federal systems. So we currently live in a federal system in the United States where you have the federal government, which has devolved some controls to states, and then states have devolved some controls to cities. The third one is specially empowered cities. So these are cities that have been given like explicit discretion and powers that are not saved for the state. This is even more powerful than cities in unitary or federal system. So moving along, we're seeing more power. And then finally, you have things like independent city-states, where they really operate largely separately from a national or state government. So on the right, a great example of an independent city-state is Singapore. Now, what we have seen over time is cities becoming more powerful for the most part. Cities have become more powerful relative to their national or state governments over time. This is partially a function of more people living in cities. This is partially a function of them becoming more like economic hubs, that kind of thing. But here are a few reasons. One is that we have decentralized a lot of policy that would have normally occurred at the federal level. At the national level, we have devolved policy to state and local authorities instead. This has meant that over time, cities are more powerful. At the same time, think about the United States, for instance, it's quite polarized at the federal level, at the national level. So that means that there's a lot more opportunity for lower levels to come in and fill policy gaps. The other point is that cities have grown more powerful over time due to globalization. Like I already talked about, as cities become economic hubs in the past 30, 40, 50 years, they have become more powerful. Okay. And then finally, we have things like meso-level governments that have become more important over time. And these are things like, we do have them occasionally here, don't get me wrong, but they're not as common as they would be in other countries. These tend to be like regional governments, okay? So I want to walk you through a few models of power. The first one is fiscal federalism. So in federalist systems, cities are subordinate to state and national governments, meaning that they have less power. We also see that local governments in fiscal federalism are supposed to theoretically better understand the needs and demands of citizens better because they're closer to those people. Because they're closer, they better know how to tailor and craft that policy to best suit the needs of constituents. And then they can more efficiently provide those services because they're closer to the people. Under this argument, policies are best delivered at the local level. The second model that I want to go over is the power dependency model. So this is less about fiscal federalism per se, and more that different levels of government work together through bargaining to achieve policy goals, because every level of government is dependent on one another now. So we always have this idea that government is like, there's the federal government, and then there's the state government, and then there are local governments, and it's like a vertical process. It doesn't always work that way though, right? That is a very clean and simplistic picture, when chances are you will oftentimes see state and local and federal authorities working together on policy issues. So there are three different models here. The first one is the coordinate authority model, which is distinct powers for each level. That's the one that I sort of said, like, that's sort of outdated. There's the inclusive authority model, which has centralization, hierarchy, and dependency. And then finally, there's the overlapping authority model, where much policymaking involves all three levels simultaneously. This is the one that's increasingly common. Okay. So you can imagine, I gave this example earlier, but this is the example of the housing and urban development like agency and bureaucracy at the federal level, working with the state government to take on issues of affordable housing, as well as working with a local government. And they're all working together to deliver and administer a policy at the local level. Okay, this one is far, far more common now. The second one is the third one is function, discretion, and access. So here, function is the more functions a city performs, the more power they're going to have. So if all a city does is administer, let's say, water and sewer and trash, they're probably not going to be that powerful. But say that they're also administering health and hospital, education, transportation, roads, public transit, they're going to be much more powerful. Okay, so the more services and more functions that they perform, the more powerful that city is likely going to be. The second one is discretion. So that can mean a few different things. So that can mean sort of like legal and constitutional discretion. In the American states, there's quite a bit of variety in what cities are allowed to do. So in Idaho, cities are not that powerful. Okay, the state has not delegated formally that many powers to local governments. However, there are other states, like Massachusetts, for instance, where there's more power devolved to local governments. Okay. The other thing is administrative discretion. If the state government tells you you have to administer a policy a certain way, then you don't have much discretion over that. However, if you are allowed to do slightly more, right? Like if they say and it's up to you to decide whether the welfare benefit falls between $200 and $600, that's discretion, right? That's administrative discretion, and that can go pretty far. That's also closely tied with financial discretion. And then finally is access, which just means sort of like access to the center of power in whatever policy domain that is. The final model of power that I want to talk about is multi-level governance. So this one, type 1, I think is a little more uncommon in the American context, a limited number of general purpose jurisdictions with non-interacting memberships. We're really not going to see that too often in the American context, but task-specific jurisdictions with intersecting memberships, that's super common here. So that means things like county government, city government, special districts like conservation districts, funeral districts, water districts, like all kinds of school districts, right? We tend to have in the United States task-specific jurisdictions. And so as a consequence, all of those different governments are in some ways competing for power. Yes, they have a very narrow policy domain, but they are all trying to serve like overlapping constituencies in a lot of ways. Okay. So this is just sort of like different models for governance. Ultimately, I want you to keep these in mind more as like theoretical models. There's not any real consensus on like which model always performs, because cities are so different, both like across a country and across the world. So it becomes a little difficult to compare them, but I did want to show you what sort of the different models of governance were and like what the literature shows. But head on over to the quiz and check it out real quick, and I will see you tomorrow for our next lecture.